Très heureuse de pouvoir modérer cette deuxième session de ce colloque Elles font l'abstraction, dans le cadre en fait de cette exposition qui ouvre aujourd'hui au Centre Pompidou. Ce colloque, en fait, vous pouvez le suivre directement en ligne. Vous allez choisir en fait la langue que vous souhaitez écouter, soit en français, soit en anglais. Il est traduit intégralement. Vous pouvez aussi, dans l'onglet.
Also, with the tab, you have a Q&A, so you can ask your questions and we will answer to some of your questions. And this symposium is also recorded. Therefore, it will be accessible in the following weeks on the Pompidou Center website and AWARE as well, since it is a partnership with AWARE, who works on archives and exhibitions on women artists around the world. We will start this afternoon session with Max Boersma, who is a PhD candidate at Harvard University, specializing in 20th century art. He holds a master's in art history from Williams College, and for 2021, he is recipient at Fulbright Research Grant to Berlin, Germany. And I think you're going to work on Anna Oesch, who you will talk about today. And your presentation will be about presenting some of the collages of this great figure from the Dada period, Anna Oesch. And these collages were made in the 20s to have an approach, a gender approach of cubism and abstract art by taking into account the questions of patterns that we have with sewing, namely. And this is a way for Anna Oesch, who is a great artist of photomontage as well, to show technique, creation, and to rethink the objectives of creation and to reach a critic and deconstruction of these goals. Thank you. The floor is yours, Max.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really honored to be here with everyone today. It's not the same as being in Paris, but this is the best case given the scenario, and I appreciate all the work of the organizers going into this event. So I will just, I see that my sharing is disabled still. Could someone switch that on? Yes, here it is. Just one moment. Great. So my talk today brings together three seemingly unrelated histories, those of European modernist abstraction, the commercial sewing pattern, and financial crisis. At the center of my story is the artist Hannah Höch, shown here on her employee ID card for Ullstein & Co., the largest publishing conglomerate of Weimar, Germany. Höch is best known today as the only woman among the Berlin Dadaists, and in particular as an early progenitor, as we've heard, of the medium of photomontage. With works such as Dada Review, Höch offered penetrating analyses of the promises and contradictions of Weimar politics and culture, dissecting mass media images that frequently stemmed from her employer's own publications, which included 19 newspapers and magazines. From 1916 until 1926, the artist worked for Ullstein's handicraft division, producing designs for embroidery and lace, as well as many other items alongside her practice as an artist. I will focus today on a little-known body of works by Höch from this same period, a series that not only reveals new dimensions of the artist's production, but also lends new insight into the possibilities of abstraction in the interwar years. Starting around 1919, Höch began to incorporate Ullstein's sewing and handicraft patterns into her artistic practice, resulting in a distinct series of collages in the mid-1920s. I'm showing 4 examples here on screen. Höch referred to such works as collage drawings. Crossing industrialized craft and avant-garde art, her approach extracted linear sequences and jagged shapes from the domestic pattern sheets, combining them with embroidery diagrams, lace designs, and other printed elements. What I aim to demonstrate here is how Höch reconfigured the sewing pattern in critical dialogue with cubism and abstraction, in particular, the celebrated practices of her male contemporaries. Höch's collages manifest an interplay of gendering and degendering, flaunting the feminized patterns while interrupting and redirecting their instrumentalized logics. To fully grasp the artist's tactics, one must first understand the logic of the sewing pattern itself, a de-skilled medium of domestic labor largely eclipsed by the last century's outsourcing of fashion's production. For Ullstein, the sewing pattern was largely understood as secondary or supplemental to the firm's core business of news, entertainment, and politics. But as we'll see, Huck's engagement with these overlooked patterns is all the more compelling, for it came as they unexpectedly saved the Ullstein's firm from bankruptcy. So by way of introduction, it's worth noting that the history of sewing patterns has only more recently garnered scholarly interest, especially with regard to how such patterns index transformations of capital, industry, artisanal labor, and domestic work. The earliest guidebooks for pattern making date back to the late 16th century, and the Encyclopédie was a major resource for these practices into the 19th century. Only starting in the 1830s were garment periodicals directed specifically at female consumers. In broad terms, these products democratized contemporary fashions while shifting certain labor practices away from professional tailors and into the domestic sphere. This trend increased dramatically into the late 19th century with the availability of home sewing machines and international competition between fashion periodicals. Ullstein's own pattern business developed gradually during the first decade of the 20th century. In its early days, the firm both enclosed free patterns within its periodicals, as well as operated a made-to-order pattern service. Based on magazine images, a customer could order paper panels cut to size by the firm's seamstresses, and back at home, these pre-measured designs would then be completed in fabric, making for a partial de-skilling of tailoring and dressmaking. In the early 19-teens, Ullstein further expanded its operations into an independent product line, sold in retail shops and department stores. The inexpensive sheets became a staple item by the Weimar period, sold by over 1,000 department stores in Germany, Austria, Holland, and Switzerland. Hermann Ullstein, the head of the fashion division, once referred to his flagship product as the strangest mass-produced merchandise imaginable, due to its low cost, short-term shelf life, and curious intermediary position between raw material and final garment. The use of Ullstein's patterns was marketed only to women and centered on their financial benefits. In these 1927 advertisements, a strange patriarchal figure, seemingly equal parts ghost, angel, and capitalist, as we see, implored women to be economical and choose Ullstein's designs. Their enticement to self-fashioning dovetailed with the dramatic transformation of clothing styles over the period, which included shorter skirts, looser fits, more masculinized designs, and the decline of corsets. However, it was during Germany's hyperinflation crisis that the patterns demonstrated their value and versatility most uniquely. In the early 1920s, wartime debts and financial mismanagement produced a staggering devaluation of the country's paper currency. At its worst stages, the price of bread rose to an astonishing 200 billion marks per loaf. Caught in the crisis, Ullstein's publishing empire was under threat of collapse. The firm was desperate for foreign currency, but there was little international market for their German language publications. With the company on the edge of bankruptcy, a solution was found, one recorded in the memoirs of Hermann Ullstein. As a last resort then, he writes, "We found ourselves faced with our patterns, with their catalogs and magazines. We immediately set about issuing catalogs, albums, and periodicals in 12 languages. We even distributed them to countries beyond the boundaries of the continent of Europe. From now on, our patterns could be found in the department stores of Brazil and the Argentine. They were sold in Batavia, Surabaya, and Australia. We were saved. In this way, the whole publishing house was not only kept alive, but also safely steered through the storms of the terrible inflation period," end quote. Apart from Hermann Ullstein's account here, this episode has entirely disappeared from the company's published histories. But many of the resulting publications can still be found today. As a small sample, I'm showing here sewing and embroidery books in German, French, Spanish, and Czech. The firm's handicraft division, Herck's own department, was responsible for many of these volumes, suggesting the artist was very likely familiar with these economic entanglements. So moving toward Herck's collages, I want to highlight one such book entitled How Do I Tailor for Him?, which reveals both the gendered expectations and making practices built into Ullstein's designs. By imparting the skills of men's tailoring to the housewife or mother, this handbook promises to save enormous sums of money for the family, while also producing well-fitted clothing for husbands and sons. The publication instructs the reader on all stages of production, from selecting fabric and measuring to the final execution. Here is the pattern included within the volume, the same type used by Herck. A multiplicity of clothing items is encoded here as a network of dashes, stars, dots, waves, and text. Printed on both sides and folded for easy transportation, this sheet contains designs for 129 different garment panels, representing a total of 18 complete items, including several styles of jackets, coats, and hats, a set of gaiters, and a necktie. The pattern employs a paper-saving system of overlaid diagrams that visually indexes the scarcity of raw materials in the early Weimar days. To produce a specific garment, the user first locates it along the top section of the sheet and identifies the relevant numbers and linear patterns for each necessary panel. Here we see the parts of a men's jacket. Next, each garment panel must be isolated and extracted from the pattern's tangle of lines. This task can be done by overlaying the printed sheet with transparent paper or by placing fabric underneath the sheet and employing a tracing wheel. In either case, one does not cut directly into the pattern itself, but instead transposes its lines onto another surface. Once the outlines make their way onto fabric, cutting and sewing ensue. Setting this process into motion, the sewing pattern is a key mediator in a practice of making at once industrially designed and personally enacted. The pattern is likewise a technology of gender, in the words of Teresa de Lauretis, an instrument linked both to the fashioning of gendered appearances as well as gender hierarchies of labor and work. For Weimar women, the pattern's zigzagging lines offered the opportunity to remake themselves anew. For instance, it allowed working class women to more easily adapt their clothing for entry into white-collar labor. These were no small issues for women newly eligible to vote, work, and break from restricted codes of dress. In the period, the sewing pattern also enabled trans and gender non-conforming people to imagine gender differently, opening new possibilities for refashioning the self by easing access to a range of clothing styles. For my purposes today, however, I want to foremost to emphasize the normative determinations of the pattern's labor. Its design premised upon unpaid domestic practices undertaken predominantly by women and often on behalf of men or children. As we've seen, the pattern's potentials were entangled in financial regimes and market-driven moral imperatives. So with that, turning back to Herck's series, one fact is now immediately apparent. The artist's making is all wrong. Herck cuts into the pattern rather than transposing its designs and disregards the sheet's embedded technical logic. Her compositions seem equally predicated on chance arrangement and deliberate modification, building form through an interplay of linear sequences and interstitial shapes. In late interviews, Herck coined the term collage drawing to describe these peculiar works. I like to make collage drawings out of these pattern sheets, she explained, because each of these patterns has its own peculiarity. The stroke is not a stroke, but interrupted in some way, so that it differentiates itself from the others. And now I have drawn with these lines. For Herck, her treatment of the pattern freed its designs from any predetermined order. Describing her process, she explained further that, quote, the only law that applies is to create anew. While reworking the pattern's logic, Herck's collages simultaneously engaged critically with the aesthetic projects of her male colleagues. considered this work entitled Design for the Monument to an Important Lace Shirt, which presents an overloaded upright assemblage standing on a bare off-white ground. In its busy ornamentation, incoherent armature, and highly personal and sentimental dedication, Herc's work undercuts radical investments in the monument typology and its stereotypically masculine scale. The collage provocately evokes both Vladimir Tatlin's proposal for the Monument to the Third International and Walter Gropius's Monument to the March Dead. Despite Herc's close kinship with international constructivism and Bauhaus, her modest work travesties their utopian aspirations, including the pursuits of technical rationalization, universal legibility, and radical world building. Similar interventions are apparent in On a Tool Net Ground. Here, Herc's treatment reimagines the achromatic austerity, surface mapping, and optical shimmer of Piet Mondrian's pursuit toward abstraction, which proceeded from early canvases like Tableau No. 2. For a time, the Dutch painter embraced a metaphysical opposition of masculine and feminine principles, identifying the male with the vertical and spiritual, and the female with the horizontal and material. Likely aware of this fact, Herc cunningly genders the ground of her collage by way of an undulating mesh of printed tulle fabric, while fixing geometric elements deliberately askew. Deepening these discursive rejoinders, a third example, entitled White Form, brings into focus an even more primary set of interlocutors. In her handling of pasted paper, Herc contends directly with the cubist medium of papier-collé. Compare, for instance, Herc's collage to Picasso's Head of a Man with a Hat, a work that Herc likely saw on her first trip to Paris in 1924. Much like the Spanish artist, Herc models a face at the very edge of recognition, defined primarily by a single eye and a nose in profile. This comparison leads to a quite significant realization. Herc's so-called collage drawings shrewdly integrate into one unified act the two distinct formative operations of Picasso's work, namely pasting paper and drawing in charcoal. Through her extraction of lines from the pattern, pasting and drawing become one. At the same time, Herc's approach resituates the sewing pattern's overlapping lines as a kind of vernacular cubist idiom, suggesting a procedural and conceptual link between cubism and the sewing pattern. In this way, Herc in fact anticipated later art historical scholarship. In an often overlooked article from 1995, art historian Elizabeth Cowling pursued Picasso's relationship to artisanal techniques and feminized labor forms. And in particular, her study explored home dressmaking as a potential source of Cubism's formal appropriations and stressed the close formal resemblance between Picasso's papier-collé and the flat workspace of the home tailor. Cowling was among the first to emphasize Picasso's use of dressmaking pins, examples of which remain in several of his works. These pins permitted the artist to actively fix, unfix, and rearrange his compositions in an open-ended process, a technique adapted from the placement of paper sheets on fabric or the temporary fixing of panels together during fitting. 70 years prior, Herc seems to have picked up on these very same allusions within Cubist practice. I will close by looking carefully at one final work, Taylor's Flower. Its angular scaffolding and compressed surface perhaps most explicitly engage with a Cubist formal idiom, and with each component of the work, the artist toys with gendered connotations. For the background, she employs a type of gridded paper used specifically for designing handicraft patterns. It evokes here the woven support of painting. In her treatment of the sewing pattern, Herc avoids the consolidation of a specific human body or garment type, yet the placement of the printed flower, a pink almond blossom, seems to assign sex to the disjointed assemblage, perhaps even playing off a biblical association of the blossom to the Virgin Mary. Finally, the work's title ascribes the creation to a male tailor, a move aimed, I believe, at the Cubists. In addition to synthesizing the technical logic of Picasso's papier-collé, and underscoring connections to domestic labor, Hark's work interrogates Cubism's analytical deformation of the female body. The artist regrounds Cubism's claims to aesthetic novelty within the feminized reproductive logics of the pattern. This opposition between masculinized artistic experimentation and feminized domestic work is one that can be further traced through Hark's production and writings, but I'll leave this longer story for another time, unfortunately. For now, the illustrations of Ullstein's sewing handbooks make evident the work's pointed allusions. Anticipating Cowling's scholarship, Hark's work resituates Cubism's formal strategies within the chance arrangements and fragmented forms familiar to any user of the sewing pattern. So to conclude, these collages taken as a group flaunt Ullstein's feminized patterns while simultaneously redirecting their instrumentalized logics of domestic making. In short, Hark genders her materials and processes in order to register the forcible degendering of her treatment. The term degendering in this context does not entail an attempt to bypass gender, but instead the active resistance of its determinations at the level of practice. Sociologist Judith Lorber writes that, quote, degendering doesn't mean not thinking about gender. Rather, it starts with the recognition that gender is a binary system of social organization that creates inequality. Therefore, degendering attacks the structure and process of gender, the division of people into two social statuses, and the social construction of what we call the opposites. Lorber's writing calls for the end of a social and institutional order premised on gender divisions. In a similar way, Hark's series probes gendered oppositions within forms of labor and artistic making. In closing, I find that what animates this body of work is precisely the tension between gendering and degendering. Hark's collages serve as a retort to Cubist and abstract practices, undercutting their claims and procedures by means of feminized tropes and processes, while simultaneously destabilizing these practices in turn. Her series grounds the avant-garde's heroicized experimentation in domestic labor at the very same historical juncture within which the sewing pattern functioned as an essential yet unacknowledged financial instrument for Ullstein. What we encounter in Hark's work is a different model for interwar abstraction, one that permits both connectivity and contestation between media and forms of making. Submitting the sewing pattern to new ends, Hark puts abstraction to work for the critical unlearning of gender codes, labor practices, and prescribed roles. As she herself suggests, quote, the only law that applies is to create anew. Thank you very much. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Merci beaucoup, Max Boersma, pour votre intervention qui est tout à fait stimulante.
Thank you very much for this presentation, very stimulant. And we'll come back to the questions later around the practices on Anna Hoch, who looks at abstraction, and we see how things emerge from this technical approach to these sewing patient models, and how, thank you very much for this very stimulating presentation, and to present Hannah Hoch's work, which is not well known enough yet. A lot of students are working on her, obviously. So now I will suggest to go to our second panelist. So I see that Elena Di Raddo is connected, probably from Italy, I imagine. Hello, Elena. Elena, you are an associate professor in contemporary art history at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan, and a member of the Research Center for Italian Abstract Art, which is a very important entity for research on abstraction in Italy. And you will speak about the work of three abstract artists who were active in the 30s and 40s, Carla Badiali, Cordelia Cataneo, and Carla Prina. So they were actively involved in Como and in the 40s, and they are totally unknown in France. So this is to connect the work has been connected very recently today in Italy with there's a gallery also in Milan, and they worked on certain reflections and objectives around Cubism as well. So it was also a question to rethink the part of these arts and the incidents they had and their way to tackle abstract art in Italy in those years, the 30s, the 40s, which are also very marked by fascism. So these were the times of fascism. And there's also an exhibit to Carla Badiali, a great figure of the abstract art, an exhibit that will bring together two artists, and at the Carla Bruni gallery until September. And this echoes to the exhibits that to Elles font l'abstraction that we had at Beaubourg, but also it is a very rare moment. We have never united these two artists who have two very different styles in abstraction. Thank you very much, Elena. And now the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you for to the organization for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you despite the distance. So I would like to thank Regina's exhibit in Italy, who is going to open in Bergamo. And just one moment, please. I need to share my slides with you.
J'arrive.
It's almost ready.
Voilà, vous le voyez? C'est bien?
So can you see it now? Yes, good. Yes, we can see your PowerPoint. Thank you very much. So in some photographs taken at the Venice Biennial in 1942, next to the poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti and the futurist painter who were exhibiting in the rooms dedicated to Aerofuturism, there are also women. They were not really futurists, but protagonists of abstract art. These were Carla Badiali and Carla Prina, and at the same occasion, although she is not in the photographs, Cotrelia Cataneo, who was also invited, artist whose work is still waiting for full recognition from the critics. The history of abstract art at its origins in Italy, as in the rest of Europe, is in fact an essential male history. It was only in 1980 that an important exhibition organized by the art critic Lia Vergini, entitled L'altra metà dell'avanguardia, brought to light in Italy for the first time women who had been completely forgotten by art history until then. Among these artists, there was also one of them, Carla Badiali. On the contrary, Carla Prina and Cordelia Cataneo were not represented. The latter two have not yet received the appropriate critical recognition, perhaps because they are linked in their private lives to architects who have obscured their fame. The first was married to the Swiss architect Alberto Sartoris and contributed with him to the creation of an important link between art Italy and the European artistic environment. The second was the sister of the rationalist architect Cesare Cataneo. In fact, in her works, she showed an autonomy and an originality of research that are not present in her male colleagues' work. In the city of Como, in the 30s, a circle of artists was formed around the figure of the rationalist architect Giuseppe Terragni, who, together with the work of the Milione Gallery in Milan, constituted the only Centre of Abstract Research in Fascist Italy. The women of the group did not appear in the exhibitions organized by the Milione Gallery, perhaps because they were too young when their male colleagues Ro and Radice exhibited in 1935. But we really owe the turn and the change towards abstraction of the famous Milanese Gallery, promoter of abstraction in Italy, to a woman. At the time, in fact, the gallery was directed by Gigi Bottinelli, herself an avant-garde photographer and wife of the rationalist architect Giuseppe Figini. The Milan Gallery was also frequented by in the 1930s by the Como Group, which at the time was not yet formally structured as a group, but whose ties were forged by frequent visits and by numerous collaborative projects between artists and architects. What critics have always called the Como Group was in fact never officially created until the early 1930s, when the philosopher Franco Ciliberti founded in 1938, the Valore Primordiale group. He founded the Gruppo Primordiale Futuristi with the futurist poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. During the 1930s, the autarky and hostility of fascism towards avant-garde art, as the article in the Tevere that defines it as foreign, Bolshevik, and Judaic, illustrated by the works of the artists and architects of the group of Como, and Milan as well, the rapprochement with the futurist Marinetti, the approach to the futurist Marinetti, who was still favored by Mussolini, was a way for these artists to participate in Italian cultural life. But there were also stylistic motivations that brought the futurists closer to abstract artists in the 1930s. So the first proclamation, assertion of the group, the Manifesto dei Futuristi Primordialità Futurista of June 41 is introduced by the signature of Marinetti, but as we have been able to verify thanks to the documents in the Ciliberti archive of the Como Municipal Library, the elaboration of this manifesto was very articulate. In the final version of October, it came out with the title Manifesto del Gruppo Primordiali Futuristi Santa Elia. The addition of the name of the futurist architect Santa Elia is due to Marinetti, who also intervened in the accentuation of the futurist component compared to the first version. The manifesto thus unites Ciliberti's primordialist ideas, which place the abstract work of art at the origin of the new epoch. I quote, a way of rediscovering the original primordial unity in the diversity of forms. With the will to find futurism at the origin of this new time, and therefore also of abstract art, Marinetti's version of the manifesto begins with, from Sant'Elia to Boccioni, generative lights, architecture and abstract painting modulate unity where everything fades away. This official presentation of the group took place on December 14, 1941 at the Ettore Maccioni Gallery in Milan with a speech by Marinetti that introduced the exhibition by emphasizing the contiguity between the modernity of futurism and that of abstract painting. The poster was in fact signed only by Carla Badiali. There is no Cordella Catano or Carla Prina, perhaps another sign of the flowered role of women at the time of the group's foundation. But what was the position of these circles towards women? Although the futurists were essentially machists, and the first manifesto, that of 1909, signed by Marinetti, unhesitatingly proclaimed the contempt for women. Alberto Sartori, one of the central figures of the Como Group, in his book Luci sulla scuola moderna, a volume dedicated to Marinetti, written between 1938 and 1939, quotes in full the word proclamations of the Manifesto della Donna Futurista, written by Valentine de Saint-Point in response to Marinetti, where the role of women in modern society it highlighted. This manifesto focused on social change that imposed, for example, that men and women must contribute to the maintenance of the family through work. The women I'm presenting today are precisely modern women in this sense as well, mothers, but also artists and entrepreneurs. Carla Badiali, in particular, was not only a painter, but also the promoter of a flourishing entrepreneurial activity, a textile design studio, which in the mid-30s, and then after the interruption of the war years from 1948, became a point of reference for textile design. During the Second World War, moreover, with her husband Alessandro Namias, Badiali became an active protagonist of the activity of the resistance, distinguishing herself for her photographic skill in falsifying documents and passes. This activity cost her husband, as a Jew, deportation to Mauthausen, from which he returned physically and psychologically devastated, and Carla's imprisonment in the prison of San Vittore in Milan. Born in Novedratte, Carla Badiali studied painting in Saint-Étienne, France, where her family lived, and then in Como, studying music from a very early age at the Istituto Nazionale di Settifico, where she meets Manlio Ro, with whom she will always be in contact for both the design of fabrics and painting. Although she was about 10 years younger than her colleagues, it is safe to say that she probably produced the first abstract work within the Como group. Radice and Ro arrived at abstraction around 1934. Carla Badiali, on the other hand, was already an abstract artist when, in 1932, she was commissioned to produce some decorative panels for the headquarters of the Circolo della Vela, an Art Deco building built on the lakefront in 1930, designed by the engineer Balsamo, with the participation of Attilio Terragni, the brother of Giuseppe Terragni. This work was unfortunately destroyed, but there are several studies that were made between 1932 and 1933. The original style of the artist has two particular aspects. Firstly, the soft colors in shades of pink, which lighten the geometric structure even through superimposed glazes. Secondly, a composition that is not rigorous, but, so to speak, narrative or allusive to atmospheres and forms that, in a certain way, led back to the very destination of the work. How can we not see the allusion to the sail in the convex red shape in the center of the painting and to the colors of the lake, from the blue of the water to the green of the mountains that surround the basin of Lake Como? Carla's style seems impregnated with lyrism and a subtle ambiguity, typical of the suggestions and suspended silences of metaphysics, as Giovanni Onzani writes, comparing her painting to that of Paul Klee and Atanasio Soldati, and I would add to that of Jean Arp and Osvaldo Licini, precisely because of its intrinsic poetic vein, rather than the more rigorously geometric research of Manlio Ro, who is decidedly closer to the works of Moholy Nagy, for example. Works such as Composizione in Rosa and Composizione in Verde, dated in 1938 and exhibited in the futurist rooms of the 1942 biennial under the title Dinamismo Astratto, Abstract Dynamism, shows some particular characteristics of her language, such as the patches of color, the play between geometric shapes of different sizes and colors, and the transparencies which contribute to lightening these structures, alluding also to an architectural dimension. And in this sense, we must emphasize the influence of racialist architecture, perhaps the most obvious in Radice and Ro, also on the work of Carla Badiali. The lyrical dimension, grafted on a more constructive geometric composition, emerges, on the other hand, in the Composizione number 33, where we find you can see a distribution of geometric shapes with luminous points and transparencies, and in the center, a sinuous black line that, with a a play also on the perspective interrupts the orthogonal geometry. This solution will have its own resolution, so to speak, in the series The Wind is Rising of 1942, compositions in which the line appears completely free and playful on homogeneous backgrounds of color or slightly shaded. These paintings have been rightly compared to Kandinsky's paintings, first exhibited in Italy in 1934 at the Milione Gallery, which the artist may have visited, but it also reveals Badiali's interest for music and perhaps also for Japanese calligraphy, as evidenced by her drawings on fabric. Since the 1930s, the painter has always separated her artistic activity from her profession as a textile designer, succeeding perhaps also for this reason in keeping up, especially after the war, with the large textile companies of Como and especially with the Legler cotton mill of Ponte San Pietro, with which the couturier Hubert de Givenchy and Pierre Balmain collaborated. The numerous creations of the 1950s and 1960s testify to the international success of Carla Badiali's studio, which had been since enriched by many collaborators. The variety of compositions between geometry and figuration also confirms the ability of the artist and her team to create an excellent relationship between industrial production and artistic creativity. Times, after all, had changed, and the new role of art in industry, sanctioned by the birth of design at the Milan Triennial, had perhaps also convinced Badiali to try to reconcile her two souls of artist and textile designer. This is a recent declaration that you can see on screen that she made. In the biennial of 1942, Cordelia Cataneo exhibited two works entitled Abstract Dynamism, number 15 and 16. Among the abstract artists of Como, she was the youngest. When she exhibited in Venice, she was only 21 years, but her language already had a very personal imprint. Unfortunately, her finished works are not numerous due to an illness that led her to spend a large part of her short life hospitalized in various hospitals, but in her archives are preserved many drawings and pastels that reveal her aptitude for geometric research. Her training took place in Mario Radice's studio, and some of the small drawings found in her archives are influenced by the master's research, not only in terms of composition, but also of brush strokes. On Radice's label, however, there is also a more spiritual component. For Cordelia, painting is also a search for her own psychological equilibrium, as suggested by the small autobiographical drawing that shows her serene amidst a forest of geometric figures from which an eye emerges. Spirituality and ideality are also very present in the Cataneo family. In the same year, 1942, her brother Cesare, also a writer, planned the Casa Familia per la Famiglia Cristiana based on the reevaluation of the spiritual and genetic role of the family nucleus. In the studies carried out at the end of the 30s, the artist was still searching for her personality, which emerged decisively in her works of 1941 to 1942. 41 to 42. Moving away from the master, one immediately notices in these compositions as a lightening of the color tones, as it is the case in the abstract composition of 1941, and you see the definition of an open, almost airy speciality. In the works exhibited at the 1940 biennial, there is also a predominance of white, which forms the background of a composition of shapes playing on the balance between the circle and the square. Here again, the effect is one of extreme lightness, ordered compositions in which geometric structures seem to be functional to a game of appearances of the spheres, giving the idea of a dynamic, more cosmological than physical, slow but inexorable and constant, like the movement of stars and constellations. Cordelia had a very close relationship with her architect brother, with whom they wrote a lot. They exchanged letters. And I think that in her paintings, we can see a relationship precisely in this element of transparency and lightness. This is an aspect that characterizes the projects of Cesare Cattaneo, marked by the balance between full and empty spaces. And in particular, thinking of more sculptural work, the project of the Fountain of Camerlata, realized in collaboration with Radice. The sketches reveal the search for a solution in the balance of the circles and spheres that compose it. This formal balance is found in some elements of Cordelia's paintings, where the sphere is inserted in the circle and therefore blocked in the compositional elements. Of the three women painters from Como, Carla Prina is the most international, not least because after her marriage, she lived with her husband, the architect Alberto Sartoris, in Cossonay near Lausanne. In this ideal history of women's art, Michel Sefour places Carla Prina alongside Sonia Delaunay and Sophie Taubira, and two women closer to her generation, such as the English sculptor Jocelyn Chewett and Marcel Kahn. In 1942, Sartoris defined hers as an absolutist painting based on an aesthetic science that concludes optically, spiritually, and physically the chain of chance that defines the nature and materialization of this artistic thought. In the futurist pavilion of the 32nd Biennial of Venice was exposed a key work as the Composizione Assoluta number 6, which summarizes the sense of her research in those years. Futurist rhythms close to those of Prampolini and neoplastic structural rigor coexist in the paintings created between 1939 and 1942. These were her first truly mature works created after her training at the Academy of Brera, and then alongside the painters of Como, Ro, and Radice, whose assistant she became. The double matrix, therefore futurist and abstract, is resolved in a painting that has a mystical and poetic dimension. In her work, geometry is far from mathematical rigor and is rather impregnated with feeling, lyricism, and tension, thanks to the drawing and the generally soft and muted colors. The work is played on the dialectic of the static and dynamic, of the orthogonal relations, and of the diagonal as a rupture of the spatial balance. In Composizione, within the structural grid, the spherical element placed in a closed square space is imbued with a subtle metaphysical meaning. As for example, in a metaphysical painting by Morandi, the sphere escapes the static rule of the grid and engages in an ideal movement, which is not physical, but of a vital, immaterial, psychological nature. Metaphysical suggestions are also present in other of her compositions, as well as in the works of other Italian abstract artists, such as Atanasio Soldati and Prampolini. I believe that other works of Prina's could be compared to these, such as certain compositions in which the forms seem more fluid and organic. Immediately after the Italian experience, and I will conclude shortly after, Prina was among the founders of the Escuela de Altamira in Spain, where she worked alongside the surrealist master Juan Miró. Carla Badiali, after having interrupted her work as an artist in the 50s to dedicate herself exclusively to weaving, began in the 60s to undertake a more analytical research, which also manifests itself in the numerous collages of those years. In her last years, Carla confided to Alberto Longatti, journalist and historian, rather demoralized, when they remember the abstracts of Como, they will say, and then there was also Carla Badiali. With this speech, I hope I have contributed, at least in part, to compensate her and the others as well, and to have given them a deserved visibility. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Elena Di Raddo, pour cette communication. Je pense qu'on va avoir aussi des questions sur ces artistes abstraites.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm sure we have questions on these abstract on these abstract artists from Combe. A lot of they're not very present in Italian museums. A lot of them are in private collections, and their work has certainly been overseeded by their male contemporaries. But we'll go back to that after the last presentation that we'll hear now, and that will close the first part of of this afternoon before we have questions to the three presenters. So is Róna here? Yeah, hello, Róna. I'll introduce you before I introduce your topic. You worked as a curator at the Ludwig Museum between 2006 and 2015. In 2016, you joined the ACB Gallery as an artistic director, and you're the co-founder of the East Topics project. You also hold a PhD in art history at the History of Paris, of the Sorbonne. And in your presentation, you'll talk to us about Katalin Nador, the Hungarian photographer who has developed between the 60s and the late 70s that used the question of enlarging, superposition, folding, transparency, opacity. And so issues of what's at stake in photography. But she used that in order to rethink a certain abstract photography. Thank you. You have the floor. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be part of that program and very happy for Katalin Nador, who hasn't been able to experience the subject that was due to her. I'll switch to English now and we'll share my screen.
Une seconde. Voilà. So Katalin Nador was born in 1938 and was known for decades as the photographer of the János Pannonius Museum in Pécs, southern Hungary, where she worked documenting the artworks of the collection between 1961 and the 90s. Her secretive life and work that remained in the shadow until 2015 reflects the fate of women artists in Central Europe, as well as in a small town during state socialism. Her practice unfolded in silence for decades, deprived of professional attention and recognition, despite its graphic quality, sensuous experimentality, and abstraction. Katalin Nador referred to her experimental photographic works created between 1963 and the end of the 70s as games. The title reflected the artist's humbleness and the habitus of the profession, indicating the playfulness of these photos. It also posed the traditional question of whether photography is art. Several factors inspired Katalin Nador to develop an experimental practice. Firstly, the milieu of the János Pannonius Museum in Pécs, with its commitment to modernity where she documented the artworks of such prominent artists as Ferenc Martin, Tihamér Gyarmati, and Victor Vasarely. Secondly, her collaboration with the artists of the Pitch Workshop, and through them, her encounters with the various neo-avant-garde tendencies, as well as conceptual practices. Thirdly, her cooperation with her master, Ferenc Lantos, who consistently researched the common structures of art and nature through programmatic geometric reduction. Finally, the Bauhaus heritage and constructivist influence, both deeply embedded in the intellectual history and the architecture of Pécs. It was through the lens of museum sculpture photography that Katalin Nádor discovered those everyday sculptures and reliefs which she used to represent the ambiguities of artwork photo and photographic artwork. These included fan-shaped pencil shavings, drinking glasses, the cannonballs of the castle of Szigetvár, sugar cubes with coffee beans, brick walls and manhole covers, a pile of window frames, pearls, clouds, leaves, flowers, and collages of old photos. The photographer explored these trivial things through the formal language of modern sculpture, expressive distortions, non-figurative geometric structures, and transcended inanimate objects through the mean of photographic enlargement, writing with light her personal surrealist poetry of the insignificant. In relation to light, the sequence is entitled Simple Objects that you see on the left side. Full title, Simple Objects, the Object's Relationship to Light, present the story of photographing a cube in various positions and with different lightings. As the light moves, the object shows various spatial and visual aspects. This work tells parallel stories running along two tracks, which plays on the minimalism of scenes where, I quote, the object is still, the light is moving, or the light is still, the object is moved around. End of quote. Katalin Nádor turned the process of taking the photographs into a visual narrative, to which she often added written documentary, commentary, notes describing different steps of the process. In other words, a diary of moving object and light. As the artist remembered, I quote, "In everything I photographed, I manically sought geometry and abstraction. Of course, the museum objects I worked with were at least partly what gave me the inspiration. I often enlarged these photos to a point where they had geometric effect." End of quote. With the Pitch Workshop, during the 1970s, Nádor collaborated closely together with the group. The members were Ferenc Ficek, Károly Hophalász, Károly Kismányoki, Sándor Pincehelyi, probably the most well-known of the group, and Kálmán Szijjártó, that she met in the museum where she worked. Teaching the young artists how to use the camera and to develop photographs, she also documented numerous performances, photo actions, land art interventions, as you see on the screen, and concept pieces of the group. The young artists, breaking out from the studio, were interested in how geometry would behave in a natural environment. While Nádor was infusing technical knowledge in them, they were in return showing her how anything could be photographed. Nádor's contribution to the Pitch Workshop's activity led in the authorship of the photographs of Ferenc Ficek's performance entitled Shadow Exchange in 1977, Károly Hophalász's conceptual action Private Broadcast, 1974, that you see on the right side of the screen, or Sándor Pincehelyi's iconic piece Sickle and Hammer from 1973 on the left side of the screen. Katalin Nádor also took part, together with the Pitch Workshop, in the demonstrative exhibition of the Hungarian neo-avant-garde in the Balatonboglár Chapel in 1972, while it was strongly censored by the authorities. Despite this close collaboration, her name and co-authorship remained unknown for a long time. Painter and teacher Ferenc Lantos, who was also the master of the Pitch Workshop group, and who consistently researched the common structures of art and nature through programmatic geometric reduction, asked Katalin Nádor to illustrate his pedagogical program in 4 volumes entitled Nature, Vision, Creation between 72 and 76. This is what you see on the screen, with details of brick walls, details of the exoskeleton of insects, details of rocks, of beehive, etc. Inspired by this cooperation, Nádor developed a body of work which echoes in its philosophy Ernő Kállai's bioromantic theory, which pointed out the correlations between abstract art and the laws connecting microcosm with macrocosm. Katalin Nádor's graphical still life details and analysis reveal a sensitive, singular artistic perspective that examined the aesthetic relation and reciprocity between nature and architecture, landscape, and object. Through the lens of abstract photography, she sought to reflect structures pervading the universe. She says, "My relationship with Ferenc Lantos was important in this respect, since a lot of texture studies, motif experiments, nature details, and close-ups of trees and flowers were created for his didactic exhibitions and publications entitled Nature, Vision, Creation. Lantos gave me a way of seeing a certain attention to details." Pécs city, albeit far from the capital, Budapest, was a progressive, culturally and artistically vibrant place, which beneficiated from a special cultural political status compared to the rest of Hungary at that time. Being the hometown of artists like Marcel Breuer, Andor Weininger, Farkas Molnár, and later Victor Vasarely, not only did the city bathe in the constructivist, geometrical, architectural, and intellectual heritage of the Hungarian Bauhaus, but also in the freshly emerged visual language of op art. Katalin Nádor's practice naturally resonated in its aesthetics with György Kepes and László Moholy-Nagy's photographic oeuvre, as well as in its permeability and playfulness, again, with the spirit of the great Bauhaus predecessors, a spirit that was deeply embedded in the intellectual history of Pécs. Katalin Nádor's experimental practice unfolded in photographs, but also photogram-like photographs. She says, "The idea first came to me in connection to a Moholy-Nagy photo. It inspired me to throw the motifs onto the paper, a special ultra-thin paper called dokubrom, with a light sensitivity of 3 to 6 din. It was so transparent that various forms and object details could be projected through it. I made many such photos where I copied or projected them one, two on another, 2 or 3 times over, which were then arranged into a composition by random chains or my own hands. There were also instances where I applied multiple positives of the same photo onto one another. I placed the still wet photo onto a glass plate and then put another photo on top of that. Or alternatively, I placed the glass plate over the photo and then added the next motif. I played around with this method a lot. She continues, in taking photographs, it was not the camera and technology that captured my imagination. After a while, I was interested not in the camera, but in lights and spatial effects. At that point, everything becomes a blur. I always say I am not a photographer, but someone who works with light. And if that is what I say, then the photo as a tool can be categorized under anything, and it becomes acceptable to regard it as artwork. This is how I experienced the whole process of photography. As the possibilities in this medium are varied and multifaceted, the photo can be a piece of art just like a graphic work can. Enlargement is a basic conventional gesture of photography. In her earliest series, created in the late 60s, Katalin Nador also employed this method in order to create an abstract aesthetic. Reflecting at the same time on the photographic medium, she arranged correct rolls, reels of developing tanks, lenses, and magnifying glasses in geometric compositions that, by suppressing their technical contexts, emphasize their graphic characteristics. Nador's reflection on the photographic medium also investigated the chemical reactions of the development process, among others. The blown-up details and captured movement of water droplets, soap bubbles, and acetic acid mixed with baking soda drew abstract, sometimes geometric structures. The graphic effect that characterizes her compositions result from the combination of various materials and their subtle translucency when illuminated by lighting. With poetic experimentality, Katalin Nador often operated with photographic enlargement, superposition, multiple foldings, transparency, opacity, and light effects in order to make the object of photography, the process of creation, as well as the genesis, the point of departure of her photographs, unrecognizable. This is especially valid for this series that we generically call foldings. In this series, she would arrange folded or cut, plain or translucent papers into various compositions, then place them between 2 sheets of glass, light them from one side and photograph them from the other. Although evoking the aesthetics and technique of photograms, Nador's folded series are mainly photographs. Light is a great critique, did Katalin Nador say in her latest interview. She continues, I folded, crumpled, and cut off pieces of paper and photographed them with various lightings. I placed pieces of checkered papers onto one another and rotated them, shone lights through them. Meshes and nets are also another particularly remarkable experimentation of in her work. She continues, she explains, I collected all kinds of meshes and fabrics and rotated, bent, projected these onto one another, creating rather exciting shapes. Once I asked the boys, the members of the pitch workshop, for the silkscreen fabric they use for the graphic art. I photographed it, so I had a silkscreen negative, which I then blew up into variously sized transparent sheets and placed things on them. For example, I first put the silkscreen in bubble bath and then put it on the glass plate. In the individual work of the graphic effect series, the lines of various nets, networks, fabrics, and grid points beyond their own real objectuality and become metaphors for the photography itself. The starting reality is banal here too. Photos of the lattice structure of wire fences or wrought iron gates through which we can see the things behind them in a simple duality of concealment and revelation. Then enlargement of the curved grids, structures of sieves, fabrics, carpets, mosquito nets, nylon pantyhose, and curtains come apart from reality to represent the play of light and shadows and the mysterious composition of subtly sensuous translucency. All this is an indirect reference to the traditions of European visual representation. The grid structures call to mind the Renaissance tool of central perspective, the vellum, while the waving of fabrics invokes the lines of movements seen in the chiaroscuro folds of painterly draperies. Katalin Nador's recent discovery unfolded in her solo exhibitions at ACB Gallery and also at the Robert Capa Contemporary Photography Center in Budapest in 2019. A book published, unfortunately, posthumously in 2018 by ACB Research Lab contextualized for the first time the artist's remarkable vision in photography. The volume comprises an interview conducted in the last months of Nador's life and an essay by András Nagy, museologist at the János Pannonius Museum in Pécs and former colleague of the photographer. Further international publications and exhibitions, including the photographer's works, are in preparation. Katalin Nador's work, fortunately, figure in the collection of Centre Pompidou as well as in private collections worldwide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Je vous remercie pour votre intervention. Je vous propose maintenant qu'on
Thank you very much. Now I suggest to go to a Q&A session. We had a question that perhaps the other speakers, and Elena Di Raddo and Max Boersma, could answer to. Maybe they want to turn their cameras on once again. And there was a question for you, Max. Was the places of conservation of the collages of Anna Holk, where are they? I imagine in their gallery, but perhaps you want to answer to the question that was asked in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So the 4 works that I showed are in 4 different locations. One of them is in the print collection of the Berlin museums. One is at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. One is in the collection of the Harvard Art Museums. And the last one is now slipping my mind. The last one that I showed would be, the Hamburger Kunsthalle in Hamburg, Germany.
Bien. Alors, il y a une autre question pour vous.
We have another question for you, Max, which from Aurélia Irena, who has written a thesis on Anna Hirsch under my direction at the Strasbourg University. And the question is by Aurélia Arena. It's a very long one. She wants to thank you for having shed light on the collages of Anna Hurt. And there's a conversation between practices, conversation within the artistic context. The first question is on the date, the dating. At the dates, I think you dated all the collages that you presented from 1924 in my memories, but I haven't checked. The usual dates are more eclectic and start in 19, so why 24? So that was the first question about the dates. And second question is about a comment you made on the man head by Picasso, the man head with a hat. And you said it was in 1924. I wanted to know where can it be seen? Can this work be seen? Thank you very much for your answers.
Yeah, of course. So with the dating, and I should mention this is work in progress for my dissertation. So some of these answers may change, but the dating of these works, I'm building on some conclusions or some findings by Maria Michaela and Bettina Schaschke, who, Bettina Schaschke in particular, has traced certain materials that appear in these collages to publications from 1924 that are among these Ullstein publications that I mentioned, having to do with the financial situation they had at that moment. On the basis of tracing certain elements, this is a complicated answer, but in short, you can trace certain elements most likely to have come from a publication in 1924. And so the very dates that she gives them most likely were retrospective datings that she had made. Some of the other works in this series also are dated from 24, 25, so it's plausible for additional reasons, but I'll leave it at that for now. And then in terms of the possible encounter with this Picasso work, The Head of a Man with a Hat, that work most likely was in the collection of Tristan Tzara in 24. There's a little bit of ambiguity in the provenance, but most likely he owned that work when she visited Paris in 24 for the first time. And she spent a lot of time with him at that moment. So it's very likely that she would have seen it in his collection.
Merci. J'avais juste moi aussi une question.
Thank you very much. I also had a question to ask you. I believe that you showed these 4 collages, but do you know how many of them she made?
So it's a complicated question. The work I'm doing right now is trying to put together what seems like a series of a kind of coherent series produced within a certain amount of time, around 24. And it depends, I guess, on, this is something I'm still working through, how you want to draw the boundaries around that series. What I'm considering the main parts of that series is about 10 works. She has, not all of those include the sewing pattern, but they include embroidery patterns, other types of handicraft patterns. The use of the sewing pattern is a major element in about 8 of them. And then the broader series is around 10 works that I think are probably the core of a series that she was working on collectively at that point, but I'm still in the process of kind of working through trying to trace various materials from those collages to see if I can tighten that. It might be up to 15. It depends on how you draw the boundaries.
Très bien, merci beaucoup.
Very well, thank you. So now we have a question for Róna Kopeczky about her speech on Catherine Nador. And the question is, where did the artist document the photographic documents in the performative performances, and these pictures, all they're exhibited, printed in publications? So you have 2 questions in one. Yes, unfortunately, it's a question that wasn't answered at the time, and the number of photographers was not mentioned. It wasn't considered as a co-author. It's a question that came up. and it was really studied by art historians, but it's in the last 10 years, now they're doing it in order to find a context for the creation process. And thus being said, I am continuing with the second question now. There are two great catalogs that were published on the activity of this workshop, of the page workshop, one in 2007, I believe, and the other in 2017, and in which now appears, of course, in the new catalog, we have her name of Catherine, the name of Catherine Nador. And we have, therefore, her vision is shown as essential to document these actions or these photographies. In the first catalog, on the other hand, and this is what really led us to her work, is that we saw her name mentioned for two documented actions outside, and her name didn't appear anywhere else. So this is when we wondered who she was, and we discovered her work, and that you have seen. It's experimental work, taking into account thousands of pieces of work without any structure. So this is a work that needs to be done from a general point of view for Hungarian art history, and also for the neo-avant-garde conceptual period at the end of the 60s and the 70s. And I have a question for you and a comment. I was wondering if she was hired in Hungary in for political topics. You saw there's a very political aspect. And so I wondered if she herself had engaged or committed politically and joined some political movements at the time, maybe the communist movement at the time. Unfortunately, her entire life was determined by politics of the time, and she came from a very bourgeois family. And this means that at the time she was considered, and the entire family was considered in a certain way, and she didn't have access to studies, to artistic studies. She was denied that, and she couldn't work either, or it was really necessary for her to receive help. So she managed to find a job in a school at the beginning, at the far end of Hungary, which after some time helped her to work on photography. And after that, she joined the museum. But in fact, the beginning of her life was really marked by moving to different places, her parents being delocalized, and she was sent to places where it was impossible to rebuild their former life. And so it's very difficult in such a context in which the family is being monitored, because they took part later to political activities, but it is said that she contributed to the neo-avant-garde art in a chapel, but that was something extremely bold at the time, and that could have cost her professional condition entirely, and her social condition. Thank you very much. So by keeping in mind the work you presented, all the details on nature, the butterfly wings, that really made me think of the photographic work of Johann Lemper, a German photographer. So I wanted to ask you if you knew about this, if you saw this similarity. But of course, her work is more geometrical, and it revolves around architecture. Now, there are questions for Elena Di Raddo. And we had a first question. So the works have Carla Bagliari's art represented in galleries in Italy? That is the first question for you, Elena.
Alors, non, elles ne sont pas exclusivement représentées par des galeries spécifiques.
They are not only in specific galleries, but a lot of work has been done by the Spazio di Temporaneo gallery in Milan, especially for Prina, who has organized several exhibitions of that artist. For Badiali, no, there's not one gallery that would represent her. And same for Cordelia Catano, who's
de tableaux. Et
who painted very few paintings and a number of works. And like you said at the beginning, are in private collections. Or maybe there's a few things in the Pinacoteca in Combe, but there's a lot of work to be done still. Yes, it's Prina is the most represented. But it's surprising to see that Celan had this great exhibition on art, Italian art under fascism and the Prada Foundation a few years ago. And I remember seeing a number of works by Italian abstract painters, but I don't remember seeing any of the work in that exhibition. I don't know, Elena, if you can tell us more. No, that's right. She wasn't there. And the problem is that there's not one gallery or galleries who have led to that artist being more valued. And it is work that still needs to be done, especially with archive that will be studied from now on. And there was a study grant by the Barrichello Foundation in Rome that's been created to study that painter. And maybe the Novecento Museum in Milan could have an exhibition on abstract women painters in Italy. You have another question. There's another question to you. You showed a presentation of artists in the Venice Biennale in '42, and there's the question of the absence. So there's the absence of some artists, and how the works that you showed, were they received? In 1942 at the Biennale, all three artists were presented. There was none of their work weren't presented in 1940 at the first Biennale, because the artists from Combe were only the male artists. But what's interesting is that all the Combe artists and abstract artists in general change the title of their works from composition to aerodynamics, to show there was a futurist dynamic in there, because Marinetti was there. So interesting that they changed the titles. But I think it's yeah, I think there's a lot to do on Italian abstract women painters in the 1940s. And yeah, there's a lot of work to be done through archives, especially. A lot of studies have been written, but there's not a lot of knowledge outside of Italy. But I think it's a problem because a lot of the studies are done in the Italian language in general. Maybe it's the case in general. I don't know if there are more questions. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A section. So we're a bit early. Should we close now, or do we have to stay online?
Alors Max, vous avez encore une question.
Max, you have another question, and I'll read it to you in English, and it's a very long question.
Thank you so much to all panelists for fascinating presentation and material. This is a question from Max in the spirit of what Dr. Pollock suggested earlier. As the artist and sharing in an event and indicative of imaginaries. You excellently and convincingly mapped Auge collage to comparative artistic precedents. But I was wondering whether it might be worth speculating further and outside the strict degendering ideas on how this collage might respond to the provocative and incomprehensive master pattern map.
I can take it up from here. I see there's a little bit more of the question about inflation. I mean, there's,
oui.
Yeah, with the presentation today, I certainly tried to present a very constrained story, a kind of tight story about what these might mean. But exactly these kind of broader questions of, say, what did she think of the status of these practices, given their entanglements with the inflation crisis, is extremely rich. I think for me, she doesn't write a great deal about these patterns. The kind of one real comment that she has in the period kind of makes a dismissive comparison between Ullstein's patterns and the lace-making practices of women in Italy, which she greatly admired. And I should note she was very well versed in all of a broad range of embroidery and handicraft techniques. So I want to project a lot into, say, what these would have meant for her given inflation. And there's also one other thing I guess worth mentioning. She wrote earlier in the period around 1918, very enthusiastically about the possibilities of abstraction in embroidery itself. So not using the pattern, but actually in actual embroidery practices. And then for her, most of her embroidery work did ultimately fall within her production for Ullstein, for her job. So it's tempting to then to project, why did she choose to actually collage with the patterns and make that her practice to explore abstraction rather than a broader engagement with embroidery itself? It's really tempting. I have a lot of things I would want to say that I can't necessarily support with great historical, say, statements by her. But I do think what I'm really trying to get into is what the inflation crisis could have meant for her turn to these works at that moment. What would the status of these patterns be for her at that moment? And unfortunately, the Ullstein archives were lost in the war. So it's a very fragmentary process of building up a story of the circulation of these patterns internationally. I hope to have more to say. I think for me, her trip to Paris in that same moment, plus her engagement with international constructivism in that same period, as I'm trying to show, I think for her, it gave her this kind of double situation where she could interrogate the patterns while also interrogating these precedents of abstraction in her moment. And that's, for me right now, the kind of most coherent story I can tell about these works. But thank you so much for the question.
Et je pense qu'aussi cette question des patrons de couture, c'est aussi un moyen.
I also think that the question of these patterns is a way to renew some aesthetic issues that are at the core of her approach. And there's a question of the issue of the collage that we have in the montage. So it's a way to open up the making, the practices, the technicity. But I'm not sure if it is a political question. I don't know if using these elements from a new consumer society in Germany, I don't know if she's reflecting on consumerist issues, or I think it's a way to use formal elements to generate a new aesthetic imaginary.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting about choosing to use these patterns is there's something that constrain or kind of form a certain audience who would understand what she's doing with them. They're very unfamiliar to people who have not used these patterns, and particularly the patterns in this moment that are just so heavily layered with different symbols and texts, and particularly because there's a paper shortage in this moment in Weimar Germany. There's tight regulations on how much paper could be used, and that's part of the reason why you see such densely packed surfaces. So I think it's absolutely for her a formal question. I think, as I tried to make clear, I think she's seeing something in Cubism that she's then trying to bring out and push further. And I think anticipating certain possible connections to home dressmaking that then Elizabeth Cowling sees later on in the 90s. I think it's absolutely about her experimenting with the formal dimension and kind of, it's not simply belatedly, say, taking up the question of Cubism, but I really do see her as an active kind of dialogic relationship with those practices that I think is worth spending some time on.
Très bien, merci beaucoup pour votre réponse.
Thank you so much for your reply to that long question. Do we have more questions?
Il nous reste quelques minutes avant de clore.
We have a few minutes before we close that session. But I want to thank all three of you for these fascinating communications that have been brought together under the theme of the motif of the pattern, which is something linked to decorative arts. And we understand today the importance in these issues, an issue of the research of abstraction in the 2030s or 40s or later. Through the photographs of that Hungarian photographer in the 60s, I think the importance of the motif, which is not only ornamental, but the motif that comes from applied arts, the decorative motif, the importance of fabric, see how some dissociated from their artistic practice to have a side practice, if you like. So we can see all these developments and all these research fields that need to be explored and give us a very rich perspective of art history as a disciplinary field that is constantly relaunched somehow. So thanks to all three of you for your communications. And we will be having a short break, and we'll have a presentation from Briony Fer, who's is an art historian at the University College London, and who has written a lot on women and abstraction. So it will be another rich moment on these issues. I want to thank all of those who have been following us. And we will be resuming at 4 p.m. So we have a short 15-20 minute break with Briony Fer. Thank you.
See that you've arrived also in the session. Briony Fer is Professor of History of Art at University College London and a Fellow of the British Academy. She's written extensively on women artists and abstraction, notably in her books On Abstract Art and The Infinite Line, both published by Yale University Press. Her interests are broad, ranging from Russian avant-garde through Latin American geometric abstraction, through contemporary art, and most recently, she has co-curated Annie Alber's Weaving Magic at Tate Modern, together with Anne Coxon and Maria Müller-Scharik of K20 Düsseldorf. Her current projects include a major retrospective of Louise Bourgeois at the National Museum in Oslo, opening up in 2023, co-curated with Andrea Krugsnes, as well as a book in preparation on the subject of art and chronicity. Finally, as a note to the audience, I would like to remind you that there will be a 30-minute question session following this presentation. And you can submit your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and please do so, since there will be plenty of room for discussion. And on that note, Briony, please share your screen, and the floor is very much yours.
Oops. Sorry, I've okay. Can you see?
Yes, everything's visible.
Okay, thank you so much, Eleni, and thank you also to Marie Chanel, and especially to Christine Marcel for this invitation to speak and to be able to share this space of reflection with you all this afternoon. I've been thinking about how difficult it must have been to bring this extraordinary, I'm sure, exhibition together over this difficult time. And Christine, you must be there somewhere. I salute you for what you've done, and I really feel a terrible loss not to be there and not to be able to see the works that you brought together at the Pompidou. But how important it feels, even at this distance, even sadly not in person, how important it feels that the work by these remarkable women artists are on the walls of your museum. And I know that we all long to see it. Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to begin not by shuffling the dates of abstraction's origins, but if you'll bear with me, by casting doubt on narratives still fixated on abstraction's origins, as if they were not subject to precisely the same set of preconceptions as the dominant art historical narrative that put the canonic race to abstraction there in the first place. Of course, I can't dispute the fact that abstraction has itself so often been preoccupied with its own origin stories. But my point is that we need to move on to see that preoccupation as itself symptomatic of a more fundamental set of questions about the relationship of abstraction and time. So this pair of images, Sophie Taube-Arp in her studio on the left at the end of the 20s, surrounded by her drawings. And on the right, Carmen Herrera's studio wall from 2017. that is just a few years ago. So this juxtaposition, I think, surely prompts us to ask, why not begin by asking about the tenacity of a language of abstraction, a tenacity that I will be calling chronic. And to what extent is this a universal language deployed by a Swiss artist at the beginning of the last century, as well as a Cuban-American artist who lived through the last century and into this one? To what extent is that history circumstantial and contingent? How far is it timeless, and how far is it timeful? Not just conforming to one temporal register, for example, that of historical time, so much as working in several temporal registers at once. Instead, then, I want to shift attention to a number of different moments within abstraction's history, only belated if one sticks to the conventional narratives of precedence, narratives of who came first. Specific instances across a wide geographic span, where I tried to identify the emergence of what the Russian literary theorist Bakhtin, best known, of course, as the theorist of the dialogic imagination and the carnivalesque, what Bakhtin called new chronotopes. Chronotopes, literally time-space, was a term for the form time took in the novel. Writing in the late 1930s in the Soviet Union under great pressure from a totalitarian regime, he identified the chronotope as a potentially radical device, and in a way that's recently inspired important work by Huey Copeland and Krista Thompson's thinking on the afrotrope, and their important writing, as I say, on the recurrence of certain motifs within an African-American aesthetic. I'd like this afternoon to strip back Bakhtin's concept a little from iconographic motif or from motif to restore something of the force of a motivating formal device to the chronotopic drive, to think how Sophie Tabarrup's model of chronicity, a model that I want to try to elaborate here, could have crystallized in the mid to late 30s in works like this on the left, and resonate too with Carmen Herrera's Iberica on the right of 1949, painted at a pivotal point in Herrera's engagement with abstraction in Paris in the 1940s. The fact that the pivotal moment of the 1940s within conventional histories of abstraction was really happening elsewhere, notably in New York, is incidental to my interest here in what I see as the more pivotal site, this site of a formation of chronotechnics, that is the formation of an arsenal of chronic devices by this period. Now, my account will be tangential. It will have to be tangential, and I'll zigzag around a little. Forgive me, not to say double back on myself, which I do now. Tabarrup's Untitled Flathead, 1920, from the Pompidou collection, poses the question of how time enters the artwork for us. Rather than a manifesto painting for Dada abstraction, which I guess it partly is, the placing of that date, 1920, isn't just a record of when it was painted, but an almost extravagant intrusion into the language of abstract painting, as is the idea of a flat head. There's an absurd peeling away of the sections she painted onto her three-dimensional sculpture of the same year. And the painting operates between, on the one hand, her flat embroideries, you see on the left, and on the other, one of her turned and painted wooden heads, which you see on the right. You can see chromatic and formal elements that have been transformed from the one to the other. The side of her nose, colored curves painted on the cheek, and so on and so forth. Let's pause for a moment to see it, to see what I'm seeing here, which is an apparently hermetic or self-sealed formal language that's absolutely porous to its outside, to other materialities, to the contingencies of a material world of which the temporal marker of a year, 1920, is simply one. The play of time and abstraction that Tabarrap set in train is also taken up in 1936 by Venezuelan painter Joaquin Torres Garcia, I'm showing you on the left, then involved alongside Tabarrap in the Cercle Carré group in Paris. That clunky clock, always provocative, repeated so many times by Torres Garcia in his pictographic grids of the time, is again oddly, almost ridiculously intrusive, like an unfortunate spot on the face of the purity of a Mondrian type grid that is painted by hand, by the way. So by this time, Tabarrap herself is making her extraordinary series of échelonnements, which you see on the right, which means in English, staggering, échelonnement, staggering, something like a scale or a ladder with a spatial as well as a temporal meaning. Like pattern cutouts, the ladders repeat in the series only to maximize difference. Again, forgive me, French speakers, but échelle in French means ladder, but it also means scale. I think that's an important fact. It begins then, the painting, as a vertical spatial stagger, but in series, as the paintings are set in train as a series, the temporal element kicks in as a time scale unfolds. So the chronotope of the series then, the chronotope of the series, to recall Bakhtin, is now powerfully in play. Now, forgive me, this will seem very sweeping, and I know I'm moving fast, and I hope not too superficially, but it's not because I want to suggest that I can adopt a bird's eye view over the last century, so much as, on the contrary, the need for multiple entry points to suggest an enfolding of one historical moment into another. You know, I keep catching myself thinking about that pitch of critical intensity in the early 1980s, or in a way, that moment 1979 to 81, that moment of the rewriting of art history in terms of a feminine subjectivity. Griselda Pollock's and Rosika Parker's Old Mistresses, published just then at that point. 1979, again, translated into English in 1981, Julia Kristeva's Women's Time. Rosika Parker's book on women's embroidery, Subversive Stitch, just a few years later. Rosika Parker, who works so closely with Griselda, and a mutual friend of ours who sadly died. But it's this constellation, if you like, as well as much theoretical work that has been pursued by so many feminist critical theorists subsequently. And maybe you should mention also here the important exhibition by Catherine de Zeger, Invisible, forgive me, I have it on my desk, I have to look at it. The visible and the invisible, and forgive me for stumbling over that important book and this concept of traversal of time that was very much brought to the fore in that exhibition. So it's this constellation of women artists, women's time, textile as medium. In my own mind, that tangle of thought is absolutely at the root of my current project to think about the time of abstraction today. It's striking how many of the new chronotopes are grounded in this reciprocal, even frenetic relationship with textiles, or at least begin there. Even if the literal textile element may end up only being residual, or in some other way sublated. Louise Bourgeois was weaving in the early 1940s on a small table loom, and she won an honorary mention for this weaving that she wove based on a design by Torres Garcia, the Venezuelan artist I just mentioned a moment ago, that she exhibited in a crafts-based exhibition at MoMA in New York in 1943. She was making her way in the New York art scene at the time, and she was also making woven samples for production, which I show you on the right, abandoning them soon after and not taking up textiles again until 5 decades later, from the 1990s on. Bourgeois will, of course, go on to make textile heads too, as if to reconstitute almost Taube Arp's flathead, as if to talk back through time in a strange material language all its own, but that's another story. So let me keep to this one. Perhaps the drawings that Bourgeois made throughout her life, but especially these from the late 1940s, show most vividly what I mean by the chronic impulse in the work. And I mean by chronic here, not just the temporal, but also something more like a chronic ailment, as if it's time now that figures as an ailment or malady, in which graphic ink lines mutate from form to form, surface to surface. Or look here at the uneven surface of this drawing called Throbbing Pulse, which of course is absolutely not a grid in any shape or form, but a draping, an enfolding, and entwining that flows like water, but also braids like bundles of fiber. Now, drawing was a daily and often nightly nocturnal practice for Bourgeois. This is the wall of drawings she pinned to her studio, and which she constantly moved around and changed. This photograph is actually from 1962 and contains drawings made at intervals over the course of the previous 15 years. So it's a strange graphic terrain that is also, I think, a kind of timescape. In her diary, Louise Bourgeois, as she was making them, had written notes. This is from 1950, I quote, knots, twists, skeins, interlacing, letters, ornament, rocaille, lace up, lace, crochet work. And then again, 1952, untangle hair, make braids, weave. You know, you can imagine there's a cascade of lists, page after page of braids and skeins. So the ink lines become something more like a feeler or a thread or a filament or fine hair or a thick hank of thread or wool, finer or coarser. In between all these words, there's the word rocaille, a French term derived from the history of 18th century ornament. This is actually a sheet, a rocaille cartouche that belonged to Louise Bourgeois. And this is a tapestry sample of rocaille from the 1730s, and its characteristic feature of ornamental frames and borders reappear again and again in Aubusson and Gobelin tapestries from the Rococo period. Most important from my point of view is that rocaille is what has been called a system of confusion. That's to say, ornamental details proliferate in such a way as to make borders porous and unstable. Curlicues and arabesques, according to this logic of heightened artifice, begin as part of a frame or border and then apparently escape the system of which they seem a part. There's a kind of extravagant, to use that word again, archaicism in many of Bourgeois' interests, as you can imagine. In Bourgeois' chronotopes, there's an interesting compression of several different temporalities, several different temporal registers, bringing them together in a fairly volatile mix, a radical confusion, I want to say. The psychic regression of childhood memory in the biographical trope of her family tapestry restoration business, which becomes such a prominent motif in her self-narrative, and historical regression to pre-modern modalities of la vieille France. When she comes later to make her insomnia drawings, the temporal confusions run amok, but many of the basic tropes, I would suggest, draw, I would say, chronically on that wall of drawings still that I showed you a moment ago. So I'm trying to get at something that's very much about form, the form of time, or the form time might take in the artwork, but that also confuses the still insidious, I think, but surprisingly common narratives of geometric versus organic forms. A language of ornament and decoration, especially as a system of confusion, is useful in undercutting precisely those kinds of binary, as well as shining a light, I guess, on the acute anxiety with which ornament has haunted and disturbed so many histories of abstraction, constantly looming there as high modernist abstractions feminized other. Now, the relationship between chronicity and the contingent and circumstantial is rather more random and uneven than perhaps we would like to pretend. I'm using the words contingent and circumstantial rather than specific and local because they seem to me to be potentially more agile to think with. And for me, at least, they're words that enable us not to fix the work in the moment and place of its origin, but rather to think about the way it moves around in time, never entirely losing its connection with the time of its making, but nor entirely reducible to it. Now, one critical advantage of Bakhtin's chronotope is the range of his examples, from threshold which is easy to imagine as a spatial and temporal opening onto something, to biography, which may seem like a very different order of, or different conceptual category, but which he again thinks of in the same terms as threshold. And biography he attributes to Tolstoy, as Tolstoy's preferred chronotope. And I think useful here, if only to mark that Bakhtin's direct attack on the biographical method, as in a way of explaining the work, his insistence on biography as a kind of narrative trope, and also more broadly, I guess, for the politics of the chronotope. For Bakhtin, biography is only one possible organizing narrative trope among others, relevant, of course, for an artist like Louise Bourgeois, who deploys her own biography in just this way. Now, although one of the criticisms of abstraction has often been that it turns its back on the world, my argument is that its danger, especially to totalitarians, is that it lets too much of the world in and flourishes in diversity. Not always, of course, not always. Every form of representation is necessarily to be fought over, but I would say abstraction's scope, let's call it its scope, what used to travel under the name of a universal language, can be calibrated and reconfigured in the perspective of time. The global infrastructure, the conduits of communications and institutional networks, the pipelines of international modernism, offer part of an explanation. Sophie Tauber was exhibited in the Sao Paulo biennials of the early 50s after her death, alongside other luminaries of European constructivism, and her role in these transnational mappings of constructivism has yet to be fully recognized for sure, but not my focus here. Rather, what I'm interested in is the transmutation and morphing of serial form, whether or not it's called geometric or organic, neither term is, I think, adequate. The point about series is that through repetition, they seek out variance, and variation is their fundamental rule rather than sameness. An organizing procedure, as here, of a grid of small wooden reliefs painted in black, gray, and white and called Book, Night and Day by the Brazilian artist Ligia Pape. A procedure that she makes visible, I would suggest, in these often staccato rhythms, but also through those gradations of the gray scale, as if she can make, and we can imagine, another way of measuring time in physical relief, casting its small shadows on a white wall as an alternative and counter, if you like, to clock time. This is Night and Day, the same piece, just at a different angle. Can you see the shadows any better? Perhaps. Maybe then, or is it, maybe I'm suggesting it's not so far-fetched to think about Pape's work that was incidentally like a subset of the larger Book of Time that she'd made a few years earlier in 1962. It's not so far-fetched, I hope, to place it together with Bourgeois' wall of drawings that I showed you before in the photograph taken in New York around the same time, or even to suggest that Pape's Night and Day on the right could be another kind of insomnia drawing, could be a system of confusion rather than construction. I'll have to leave that there. It's part of a larger project. Forgive me, I leave it dangling, I know, very loose, but speculate, if I may, this. Both artists, both Bourgeois and Pape, both artists dramatize the chronotechnic devices, whether graphic or chromatic, that they use and lay them out before us in an array of temporal possibilities. If Lydia Pape took up where Tauberat left off in her reliefs, we could also take the view from the other side of the sun, as the American poet Elizabeth Bishop described the view from Brazil. From that viewpoint, we might want to think about Tauberart's all-white wooden tondo as an exercise in the circumstantial, in the temporal. Its monochrome relief intensely susceptible to the environmental conditions of light and dark that it's placed in. Finally, and in the last section of this short paper, I want to think about the creative role of the chronotopic as it's condensed into small work, and in particular in small work by the Italian artist Bice Lazzari, who's included in the Pompidou exhibition. This is her red disc from 1967. But rather than endlessly expand the discussion with more and more examples, believe me, it's tempting. I want to reiterate some of the ideas that I've been presenting to you. And it's important for me to keep the scale modest, not to make another grand monolith of, art and time, but offer more of a manual about how a group of small works work. Basic chronotechnics, as I'm calling them, are surprisingly, even I'd say kind of fairly scandalously missing from the art historian's toolkit. And if all art, including painting and drawing, is time-based, embedded in time, as it must be, then I think we sort of need to start over in thinking about how we might describe it. Broad brush arguments only go so far. The operation to unpick the chronotope has to be more delicate, especially distinguishing major and minor chronotopes, as Bakhtin calls them, and especially as they coexist and interact with one another. So I'm going to spend, as I say, the last 5 minutes or so showing some of Lazzari's work on paper that she made in Rome, this one from 1968, and reflecting on some of this more intricate tissue. There's an overlaying of lines of black ink, thicker or thinner lines, themselves superimposed over a floating patch of yellow acrylic that's divided down the middle like a spine by a central column of finely marked tallies or dashes, as if the whole drawing consists merely of different ways of marking and measuring out a sheet of paper, of calibrating its bodily symmetries and asymmetries. The detail maybe shows that a little better. Lazzari will return frequently to this motif of a central column dividing a sheet that's often, especially as she goes on, very textile-like in its woven surface. Here the vertical lines acting like a warp and creating the effect of an answering weft achieved by painting into the wet. The dashes larger now, rather cruder, the asymmetry more awkward, less elegant perhaps. Now Bakhtin makes a nice point about the literary work that bears on work like Lazzari's, not because it's literary, but because it's often regarded as introverted, partly because of its small scale, partly because of the slightly reclusive nature of the artist. She's often seen as Europe's Agnes Martin. Every work, Bakhtin writes, faces outward, away from itself. It's a simple but important point because it suggests that the work always already anticipates possible reactions to itself from a viewer, is already, as it were, in a conversation with itself that's susceptible to time and its vicissitudes. Here there's the flickering of a circumstantial reflex of constant renewal, whereas in bourgeois, I would suggest time acts more like an ailment or malady. But rather than hermetically sealed off from the world, the work cannot but be pervious to the world. As Bakhtin puts it, we might even speak of the creative chronotope inside which this exchange between work and life occurs and which constitutes the distinctive life of the work. So diverse chronotopes can coexist then and interact with one another, or come to replace or give way to others as new versions emerge. The reactions between them are dialogical, of course, for Bakhtin. That's to say they're active and transformative. Given the work exists in time, and time is always evolving, that temporal field of action is never entirely stable and often very unstable and volatile. As work touches world, as a kind of touch paper for new connections and new chronotopes. To slightly adapt Bakhtin, but only slightly for our present condition, or in a way that seems apt for our present condition, art, like any organism, when it's torn out of its environment, it dies. But as long as it's allowed to live in some kind of resistant and yet at the same time reciprocal exchange with its environment, it thrives. And I would suggest we forget this at our peril. So different chronotopes coexist and don't necessarily oppose each other, just as different forms of abstraction do, like bourgeois drawings and Pape's series, like Carmen Herrera's 2016 drawings on graph paper that I'm showing you here and which we saw on her gallery, on her, I beg your pardon, studio wall, and Julie Moretu's large series of codex monotypes from 2018. So works by artists of very different generations, but both part of our evolving present. In a time of pandemic and planetary crisis, a case for abstraction like the one I've been tentatively trying to make may seem like small fry. But I want to suggest that the sheer scale and horror of the current crisis, not to say the sensory privations and challenges to mental health that it has wrought, only sharpens, I think, the need to think about chronicity. Of course, many of us cannot see works of art at the moment, but that sense of their sensual living presence lingers in the imagination as a kind of longing in anticipation. The intricate interplay of chronotopes offers new ways to think connections of work and world in time. But in thinking about their intricacies and the often disjunctive and discontinuous forms of attention at stake here, we might also pause to think of art itself as a complex holding pattern, comprising multiple chronotopes in an entanglement in which we are caught, but in which we are also held. And that being held is always precarious, of course, but no less vital for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Briony, for your thought-provoking and genuinely fascinating presentation that I think provides us with a set of tools through this lens of time, not to only question, but to counter this canonical linear art history. It's in a way of reconfiguring how we imagine art history's timescape and has profound implications to how we look at and interact with not only historical works, but also contemporary works by women artists in a deeply compelling way, I think, to reimagine and call for an art history that is not fixed, but is in flux. So while we wait for some questions to come in, and I really do encourage the audience to ask questions, I guess I will start with one of my own. And I would go back to your focus on the contingent and the circumstantial as linked to chronicity, and as it allows to not fix a work in a place of origin and encouraging the sense of movement. So I would like to ask you if you consider that this applies, or in what ways this applies more closely to abstract art than art generally, and what implications this has on how we might view the work made by women artists or their role in art history. So just to put that in short, what in abstract art, and here particularly in the work of women artists, allowed you to explore or stimulated your reflections on time?
Thank you. That's been a really important question for me. I know I haven't addressed it in the most direct way possible, but it's been very generative for me, obviously, in terms of my own thinking, that I have come to this question primarily through thinking about the range of a whole series of women artists, some of whom I've presented today, but in particular the work of Eva Hesse, Lydia Clark, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that I don't want to make or create what I would see as another binary opposition, because obviously I think one could mount interesting arguments in relation to the work of Torres Garcia and Mondrian, for example. But it seems to me that in the range of work that I've been trying to present to you today, the work of this group of women artists dramatizes, as it were, that set of relationships and allows us to see the specific workings of the chronotopic drive, particularly in this relationship to textility. That's only one possible manifestation of the chronotopic, but it's not to say that all this work, many of these artists, all of them, in fact, apart from Herrera, that I dealt with today, all came to abstraction through textiles. And we're going to be hearing more about that, I think, in the sessions tomorrow and after. But the point is that I think it doesn't make the work about textility. It's rather in this entanglement between the surface of the painting, for example, the painted surface and a woven surface or a stitched surface. So it's really trying to imagine an elaborate looping together of these different realms. And obviously they do have and bring with them different temporal registers. The activity of weaving, or for that matter, sewing, has a particular kind of repetitive manual involvement with the material. You know, it's not only women that weave historically, you know, it's a complex history over thousands of years where both men and women in so many different cultures weave. But I think what's important is that we can sort of try to unpick some of these relations that intensify our sense of these different temporal registers working together in some enigmatic way.
Thank you for your answer. We have another question from Georgina Glusman, who first of all thanks you for an incredible presentation. And she would like you to develop on the link between Women's Time by Kristeva and the work that by the artist that you showed today.
That's a really interesting question, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time. I found it quite an odd experience to return to that essay by Kristeva and read it now in the context of the kinds of debates and thinking within the discipline now. Its extraordinary European focus. It's in many ways seemed more alien to me than I thought I would find it. But I guess what Kristeva did in such an important way, and in a way that has been taken up and argued with and transformed through the writing of so many feminist critics and theorists. I'm thinking of, you know, Emily Apter and others. The fundamental question is, of course, about female subjectivity, and Griselda raised the crucial matter of subjectivity in her wonderful opening talk this morning. And it seems to me it was this kind of thinking about, you know, the way in which Kristeva sets feminine subjectivity and women's time between cyclical time on the one hand and monumental time on the other, that she sets up a series of frictions that I wouldn't want to simply apply or even deploy in my own work right now. But I really want to acknowledge it. And I, in some ways, found myself being most interested in the way in which Kristeva writes at that moment. And her translator, Alice Jardine, spoke rather interestingly about the way in which Kristeva in that essay almost uses the tense of a kind of future perfect. And that I find quite fascinating, because I think one of the important and urgent aspects of the problem of time right now is this sense of futurity. And I think Kristeva's essay opens on to questions of female subjectivity, of course, but refuses simple binary opposites, but also opens on to thinking about futures. And I think that seems so important right now. If we're thinking about a history of abstraction in that context, of course, you know, you might think of, well, it came up in earlier discussions, you know, the idea of von Wegen's notion of universality, which is in a way was a kind of a notion of the dissolution of difference. Whereas I think in a way, if one wants to retrieve something of a notion of a universal language that could open on to utopian futures, you know, the question I would want to say, is that just the last gasp of 20th century technocratic capital speaking there, or to what extent can we salvage some sense of what traveled under perhaps the name of a universal language, but in fact was not about a dissolution of difference, but the exacerbation and making manifest of difference. You know, how can this open onto a future practice, which I think we can see all around us, artists working not simply within conventional narratives of abstraction, but working within what in a way is an incredibly elastic and by now old set of representational strategies. And I think it behoves us to understand the polyphonic, multiple languages that we are looking at here. And I think for me, what Kristeva in a way suggests in that essay is something about the possibles of thinking the future in ways that don't simply fit into wishful thinking or utopian remedies.
Thank you for your answer. We have another question from Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, who would like to hear you speak more on the notion of abstraction as a chronic impulse. She says also about not fixing a work in a place and time beyond the idea of coexistence in chronotopes. And she mentions this because of the disparity in the way that place has meant the erasure of many artists. For example, they are not European, etc., and how place informs art and even abstraction.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think thank you for that. One aspect of the chronotope, of course, that interests me is that it places in a relationship of friction, time and place. Bakhtin actually got the term from a biologist who gave a lecture in what's now St. Petersburg in 25, Utomsky, who was a biologist. So this relationship to the life sciences and to life and to now, I would suggest, the planetary is very much thinking different scales and different differentials of scale. But the point about expanding geographies is obviously hugely important. And I feel myself what's vital here, and you know, having been involved in trying to work with the histories of abstraction for many years now, what I feel is important about the work is the pressure it puts on you to sort of think differently. So I am the first to acknowledge my own limits geographically, as it were, in the scope of my own writing or capacity to have written. And I think that's being really addressed now. I mean, certainly I've been very interested in the Global South in terms of the Latin American engagement with abstraction, which seems and was certainly absolutely left out of the narratives, and to kind of the need to respond to those kind of pressures. But what I'm also interested in is, and what I tried to hint at, if not really address, is the need for multiple entry points. So the fact that I, in a way, began with Sophie Tauber and Carmen Herrera, I mean, I think it's important, obviously, to expand our scope, but I also think the different viewpoints in time and space are also vital to see not as one symbiotic whole. This is not monolithic, but to see these multiple perspectives. I think it's very interesting right now that notions of universalism are being rethought, particularly from an Africa-centric viewpoint, particularly using Fanon and so on. So I think it's a moment when the ethics of universalism and the politics of difference are really, needing to change. And rather than fit a much broader cast of characters, as it were, into the same old paradigm, I would suggest, as I've always felt, that paradigm has to be continually shifting.
Thank you so much. Giovanni Casini would like to ask you to talk more about the idea of temporality in relation to printmaking, a range of media which many of these women artists explored in very experimental ways. And he's thinking about the idea of multiples and the actual process.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? That's true. And printmaking is very interesting here, because I think of the sense of the haptic, and the Papé herself is so incredibly articulate about her own printmaking techniques and the way in which she often invokes the metaphorics of weaving in relation to both her prints, but also her later installation work. So printmaking itself, in terms of its use of repetition, it's interesting because in some ways I've been thinking about prints a lot. This might be a little bit tangential, because I think the heart of the question is really important. But one of the ways you could answer it, in relation to an artist like Louise Bourgeois, for example, is that, some artists choose printmaking, some artists choose photography, and Louise Bourgeois, and I would say Papé, are both artists for whom printmaking is absolutely at the core of their practice. And there's something about the corporeal involvement with printmaking. It's a different form of the index from photography. So it's not the kind of mechanical reproduction of the photograph, but it's another form of, in Bourgeois' case, kind of a little bit pre-modern form of mechanical reproduction. So I think it invokes different temporalities of labor. I think it has a corporeal relationship with the body, a print making process to sometimes a loom, in the way that the body is actually in some kind of physical proximity to the apparatus. I'm rambling slightly there because it's too important a question, so forgive me for not being able to be as succinct as I should be.
Absolutely, no problem. You can take your time. It's your question session. Matilda Tajitska wants to know if you could think about a monumental public sculpture with the light of chronic impulse, especially when we think about artists coming to monumental sculpture. We could think surprisingly from the field of textile art, Herrera, Bourgeois, and Abakanowicz.
I'm not thinking of their work as monumental. I think a notion of monumental time I'm much more interested in thinking, even when they're making rather large scale work that might look a little bit like a monument, that there's something much more, or the scale differential is not that of monumental time. It's not that of perpetuity. It is more chronic in the sense that it just goes on, and in a way, I wanted to get that sense of chronicity that is about something that's interminable in some ways, but has its ebbs and flows. If you have a chronic ailment, it's not consistent, it's not persistent, it goes away, it comes back again, it lurks and it lingers. So you get this sense of something that is interminable, but it's not eternal. It's not a notion of eternity, it's not transcendental. It's intensely responsive to some subjective, and I would say psychic dimension. So I would want to, with the artists that I'm concerned with, I guess I want to reclaim them and show the resist to kind of notions of eternity, and to see something in chronicity that one is a little bit kind of condemned to, but also becomes the means of generating something new.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question, which will be from Lou Forster, who thanks you for a fascinating presentation. And he asks, he's interested in the fact that you chose 1979 as a moment to come into the chronotopes, while the 1960s are often seen as the key moment in relation to time. And he's thinking notably of texts by Pamela Lee, Chronophobia, or Carrie Lambert Biari, Being Watched, Yvonne Rainer, and the 1960. Or even your own work on seriality, The Infinite Line, as well as the work by the art historian E.P. Thompson, Time, Work, Discipline. What do you think has changed between 1960 and 1979?
Well, I specifically cited 79 because of the moment of a kind of feminist intervention that seemed to me to constellate, if I can use that word, these different realms between time, medium, and a female subjectivity. So in some ways it was to pinpoint that as a crucial moment for the histories that we're kind of discussing today. But yes, as you articulate very eloquently, the 60s is always seen to be that kind of pivotal, most intense period. And of course, the work that I've done on Eva Hesse, which I guess is very much at the core of what I've been doing all along, is the time, even to the point that she uses materials like latex and fiberglass because they have time embedded in them. They kind of deteriorate and they change color. And, there is a sense in which she, as a sculptor, is absolutely working with time as her medium. So what I'm trying to do in the larger project, I guess, is to backtrack a little bit from that, continual kind of revolving around the 1960s, to kind of break its lure a little bit, and to broaden the scope of the discussion, to enable us to think about a more expanded and uneven history. One that's much more dispersed across the globe, where everything does not sort of constellate necessarily in the 1960s. And actually the project that I'm involved in is more wide-ranging, with going back further and thinking of the main theorists of time in relation to the artwork as being, on the one hand, Bakhtin, as I've suggested today, but also Marcel Proust, who of course is in a way the great theorist of time, and then coming forward to think about people like Kubler and Fossillon and so on, but rather more putting them in a kind of much larger context.
All right, thank you so much again for your presentation and for all of your answers to these questions. I'm glad to see that there was lots of interaction from the audience and lots that they wanted to know from you. Just to tie up the day, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Women in Abstraction Symposium. We will continue tomorrow, starting with the doctoral session in the morning, and there are separate links for sessions 3 and 4 that will take place tomorrow, which are available on the Aware and the Centre Pompidou website. So thank you once again to Briony, and thank you to your audience, for joining today.
Thank you.